From Plassey in 1757 to the great famines of the late 18th and 19th centuries, the story of British rule in India is not merely a tale of politics and battles. It is a story of extraction, of how the East India Company systematically converted India's wealth into British capital, while weakening the very economic foundations that kept millions fed. Let us begin with Plassey. On June 23, 1757, the company's forces and their allies defeated Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah of Bengal. The decisive role was played by vested interests within the Nawab's court, particularly Mir Jafar, who would be installed as Nawab in exchange for company support. But the immediate consequence was not simply a change of rulers. It marked the start of a new economic relationship. Bengal became a resource base for company revenue, company credit, and company trade, often at the expense of Indian producers and cultivators. Within a decade, the company's position transformed from a trading body into a territorial power. After the Battle of Buxar in 1764, fought against the combined forces of Bengal, Awadh, and the Mughal emperor, the company obtained the Diwani, the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and parts of Orissa. By 1765, company officials controlled revenue collection. This was a turning point. For the first time, the company wasn't just buying goods in India, it was extracting taxes from Indian society at scale. The company's revenue demands increasingly became the engine of extraction. It needed cash, because it had to finance trade and, crucially, the political military apparatus of its rule. But the way revenues were extracted mattered. Under systems associated with revenue farming and short-term assessments, cultivators faced heightened pressure. Taxes were often demanded in cash rather than in kind, meaning peasants had to sell crops on unfavorable terms or borrow money at high interest. When agricultural prices fluctuated, debts multiplied. When harvests failed, famine was no longer an accidental calamity, it became a predictable outcome of policy design. Consider how British administrators used Bengal's wealth. The company's settlement of 1765 granted it financial advantages, while its own governance was oriented toward maximizing remittances to Britain. Even Parliament later recognized the company's political economy as a machine for extracting value. The result was that the wealth generated in Bengal increasingly flowed outward rather than circulating within Indian livelihoods. This is where scholars help us understand the economic mechanism. Dadabhai Naoroji, writing in the late 19th century, argued that British rule drained India through what he called drain of wealth, profits, salaries, pensions, and payments sent to Britain. R.C. Dutt, in his monumental works on economic history, emphasized that company policies prioritized revenue and exports over the long-term stability of agrarian systems. And in a modern analytical frame, Amartya Sen's research on famines explains something crucial. Famine is not only about food availability, it is about entitlement, the capacity of people to command food. When policies strip peasants of purchasing power, famine becomes likely even if food exists somewhere within the economy. Now let's connect policy to disaster. The late 18th century witnessed catastrophic shocks. Bengal's Great Famine of 1769 to 1770 is often described as one of the earliest signals of the new regime's lethal potential. Later, the Bengal Famine of 1783 to 1784 deepened the pattern. In the 19th century, the catastrophe intensified, famine in 1817 to 1818, then in 1837 to 1838, and again in 1845 to 1846. These were not isolated weather events, they unfolded in an economic landscape reshaped by British rule. How exactly did policy destroy India's capacity to resist famine? First, revenue policy made the state an extraction apparatus. When harvests failed, the company still sought revenues. If a peasant's crop failed, they couldn't pay tax. If they couldn't pay tax, they faced coercive recovery and eviction. Entitlements collapsed. Sen's entitlement framework clarifies the human math. Even if some food is present in the region, people starve when they lose access, through loss of income, loss of land, or inflated prices beyond their reach. Second, trade policy and the orientation toward export weakened local resilience. British economic priorities favored exporting raw materials to industrial Britain and importing manufactured goods. This meant less emphasis on protecting domestic food markets or building buffer stocks. In many periods, grain movement followed profit signals and export incentives, not humanitarian needs. Third, monetization and debt traps reduced bargaining power. Cash demands forced peasants to sell grain early or at distress prices. When credit systems operated under harsh terms, debt became a tool of economic control. After repeated shocks, families had fewer assets to survive the next bad season, so famine became a recurring structural crisis rather than a singular calamity. Fourth, administrative priorities undermined famine relief. Relief, when it existed, was often late and limited. The logic of governance was revenue first, not survival first. The company's posture was also shaped by a belief, common among many policymakers of the time, that markets should correct themselves. But when large segments of the population are priced out of food, market correction can mean mass death. Fifth, the transformation of agrarian society and regional economies increased vulnerability. Landholding changes, commercialization pressures, and the reorganization of local power dynamics meant that many rural communities were less diversified in their livelihoods. When drought or flooding came, they had fewer alternative income sources to buffer the loss. Now consider the British response to the 1857 rebellion, because even that shows the continuity of extraction. After 1857, the Crown took over from the Company in 1858. Yet the economic structure largely remained. The system of land revenue did not become fundamentally protective. Instead, it continued to ensure steady state revenues in colonial form, often at the expense of long-term investment in irrigation, storage, or diversified rural economies. By the late 19th century, famine reached an intensity that horrified many contemporary observers. The famine of 1896 to 1897, for example, affected large parts of India, including areas of the Deccan. The toll was enormous, and the policy debates of the time reveal the same central issue: did administrators recognize famine as an outcome of entitlements and governance, or as a mere consequence of nature? The difference mattered. If the state treats famine as natural, relief is slow; if it treats famine as political-economic, interventions can be timely and targeted. Even when British officials witnessed starvation, the incentives often favored fiscal stability and export continuity. The drain argument returns here. When colonial administration systematically siphoned resources outward, it limited the capacity to fund relief and development. In Nehruji's terms, wealth extraction reduced Indian ability to convert economic output into secure livelihoods. In R.C. Dutt's terms, the colonial economy was structured to transfer surplus rather than to build resilience. Amartya Sen's framework also helps us see why "there was food somewhere" does not end famine. If prices rise because grain is exported or hoarded, poor households starve. If wages collapse because demand collapses during crisis, entitlement collapses. And if the state delays relief or focuses narrowly on revenue collection, starvation spreads. So the arc from Plassey to famines is not just a moral condemnation, it is an analytical explanation. The East India Company's victory in 1757 created an economic regime designed for extraction, revenue demands that intensified peasant vulnerability, trade patterns that weakened local food security, administrative priorities that treated relief as secondary, and incentives that drained wealth outward. And here is the closing thought. History is often remembered through battles and treaties, but for millions, the true outcome of Plassey was not a political map change. It was the transformation of hunger into a policy outcome. The question UPSC aspirants must always ask is this: when governments control revenue, markets, and relief, are famine and starvation truly accidents of nature, or are they predictable consequences of power?